Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to join you this morning to mark a new milestone in our partnership with the Asia Society Policy Institute and its Center for China Analysis. Today's event continues a series of collaborations with the CCA to understand key philanthropic and climate policy trends in China with a focus on how domestic developments shape international action. The report shared itself as part of a two-part project to better understand the position of China's key climate policy makers and likely direction of China's climate governance, as well as survey Asia's climate finance needs more broadly and China's current steps to help meet them. Having worked with the CCA team over several years, I'm always eager to see what conclusions they reach in their analysis. I can be sure that the destination will not be what we expected upon departure, which is always so wonderful. Their thorough research and key stakeholder engagement will take us in new directions, which we all need, ultimately delivering both what we need to hear and ways we can move forward with Chinese and regional partners on shared goals. Thus, I'm sure the findings of the report launched today and our discussion this morning will be illuminating for all of us. As a global philanthropy, now focusing on transformative action across the energy, food, health, and finance sectors to address the climate crisis, we are keen to identify the most promising climate solutions and understand the avenues most expeditiously scaling them. Acknowledging and accelerating impact of climate change and its implications for humanity, last September we announced a commitment to focus all aspects of our work, including our program, endowment, and operations, to address the climate crisis. This includes a commitment to invest over $1 billion in the next 5 years to scale transformative climate solutions, big bets as we are now calling them. Critically, this includes mobilizing not just our own finances and that of our core partners, but building alliances across governments, key financial institutions, the private sector, and most importantly, the frontline communities themselves to bring big bets to life. An emerging example of this is the Coal to Clean Credits initiative, which aims to accelerate coal plant decommissioning and replacement with renewable energy sources as part of a just transition. We are now partnering with the Monetary Authority of Singapore and private sector actors in the Philippines, amongst others, to pilot this initiative, which itself could avert 19 million tons of coal. And we hope to work with partners to scale to more plants globally. We all know China is a critical player in addressing the climate crisis. The course charted by China's leaders to meet energy security, economic growth, and energy transition needs at home is among the greatest commitments, is the greatest determinant of success in our global energy transition journey. The boost given to other developing countries in the form of development cooperation, capacity building, and access to low-cost technologies and commercial investment is yet another key factor. Chinese diplomatic engagements, development cooperation, and investment are already playing a key role in shaping economic development and energy transition in Asia. And for us, like many others, understanding the priorities and likely policy directions of China's leaders and climate governance institutions is therefore essential to shaping cooperation, supporting the success of our climate goals. This includes understanding the perspectives and needs of key institutions in China and identifying paths for collaborating, supporting their efforts at home, and as they continue to deepen their engagement with Asia's developing economies. We hope that our work addressing the climate crisis in the region will be the next step in a long journey of partnership with leading Chinese institutions as they solve challenges confronting them. The history, as Jing said, goes back for more than a century when we helped establish the Peking Union Medical College. Since then, we've continued to work on health, food, and more recently, climate action. This includes partnerships with organizations like the UN China Resident Coordinator's Office, which is seeking to advance the SDGs through key China-led South-South cooperation mechanisms, as well as working with the Tsinghua University and the Global Alliance of Universities on Climate as they connect young climate leaders around the world. This also includes supporting our key partner, the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, in executing its partnership with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. We're also supporting dialogues connecting Chinese and international thought leaders through our Bellagio Convening Center in Italy and elsewhere. I'm confident that our work with the Asia Society and the insights we gain here today will inform our work with partners in China and worldwide to support China's energy transition and its contribution to global climate action. Before closing, I would like to express my deep appreciation to Jing, co-founder and managing director of ASPI Center for China Analysis. Jing, the vision that you get is really remarkable. Thank you for all that you do. Li Shuo, Asia Society China Climate Hub Director. And again, with you being in DC, I'm sure we're going to be getting a lot of impetus in all the work that we're trying to do. Wu Guang, Asia Society Senior Fellow on Chinese Politics and author of today's report. Can't thank you enough. Andrea Frodme, Asia Society Executive Director, Institutional Relations. Kate Logan, ASPI Associate Director for Climate. Taylor Bland, CCA Senior Program Officer. And of course, thank you also to all the distinguished guests in the audience for joining us this morning. I really look forward to the session and, of course, the discussions. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I am thrilled to be the one to be asking questions to these legends. So very brief introduction. First, Guoguang Wu, Senior Fellow on Chinese Politics at the Asia Society Policy Institute Center for China Analysis. You're coming to us from Stanford University, where you're a senior research scholar at the Stanford Center on China's Economy and Institutions. I had a sneak peek at the paper, and I found it extremely revealing, so I'm hoping we're going to have a rich discussion. Deb Seligsohn, longtime China resident for 18 years, I think you told me, and currently an assistant professor of political science at Villanova University, a Woodrow Wilson Institute China fellow, and also a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And Li Shuo, who I think I've only seen at the various climate negotiations around the world, so it's thrilling to see him in real life here. Director of the China Climate Hub, of course, at the Asia Society Policy Institute, and just a real pro at drilling down and really distilling China's climate positions at all of these international climate talks over the years. So I'm going to kick it off with you, Guoguang, and first really try to understand what is propelling China's climate agenda at the moment. And exactly what is China's climate agenda? Sometimes it's a little hard to understand given the buildup in coal and at the same time, this major buildup in renewables. And of course, China controls every piece of the green energy transition. So it's quite a complicated picture. Tell us first, what's propelling this direction?
The field is like, coming back to student age. So actually, just like, oral defense to talk about the topic. It's even harder than that because we are trying to interpret China's climate change policies. So we don't know actually a lot of things taking place in Zhongnanhai in Beijing. My interpretation in the report try to identify 5 major factors inspiring the Chinese, particularly current leadership, the Xi Jinping leadership, to make commitment to climate change. I think in 2020, that at last surprised the public when the Chinese leadership made the pledge, which in China is called double carbon. So actually, achieving the peak of CO2 emission in 2030 and achieve gas neutrality in 2060. So why actually the Xi Jinping leadership did that? So basically, my interpretation emphasized Xi Jinping's concern of his personal power. He actively, in his early years as a local cadre in East Fujian, southeastern province of China, in Yingde particularly, actively that region economically was backward. It was not possible to achieve so-called remarkable economic performance in his actively years of governance. And so he emphasized environmental protection at that time. So he mobilized this kind of experience as kind of resource of his legitimacy in the central leadership, and also international influence, gave him idea. Okay, so why we don't do something in climate change, better taking the leadership in global governance. Also, we know that the Chinese economy has been facing really big tests in recent years. So making this kind of a pledge, I think, can help China to upgrade so-called development into high-quality development. That's the Chinese leadership, the term they use to describe that. So basically, China tried to catch up with green revolution in worldwide scale, and so really complicated considerations in the regard, but all the factors leading to this pledge. I forgot to highlight one factor, which is China's plan to achieve so-called to reduce energy dependence, right? Because China actually, since Xi Jinping came to power, emphasizes national security.
Yeah.
But energy dependence overseas really reduces China's security in the leadership's consideration, I think. So that's really, for China's interest and also for the leader Xi Jinping himself's interest, they emphasize climate change. That's good development anyway, but China would do it in its way. Maybe we can discuss that later. Right.
Yeah. So I'm hearing three things, consolidation and heightening Xi Jinping's authority and power, economic development,
Yeah.
energy security. Yeah. Now, in these, there are domestic considerations and international considerations. Do they always align? Or among the different actors in China, are there sometimes competing goals?
Really good question. Yeah, there are dynamic interactions among those different factors. I guess,
Who are the different players in this first?
Okay. Yes, for example, I would like to emphasize local authorities. Local authorities within China, as you understand, within the hierarchical authoritarian system, it seems that they don't have much to say in central policy making. But the reality is China is such a huge country and the localities, they control so many things actually. Yeah, each province in China is usually larger than mid-sized European power actually. So in terms of governance, they have a lot of things to say in central policy making, because the central leadership has to rely on them for policy implementation, for governance, for all the things. So local authorities, particularly at this moment, they face huge pressure for economic development. And the central government also worried about that. So this is, I think, contradictory with China's pledge to double carbon goals. And also, security consideration, right? So in terms of diplomatic, for example, the diplomatic community in China, I think they are somehow split. Yeah, they have to emphasize China's autonomy, security, and China's different stances from all those, Western industrialized countries. but still they need to, get technology, they get capital, get, economic cooperation and promote trade relations with all the countries in the world. So there are also contradictions. So many contradictions, I think, emerging on the agenda. That's why actually in the report, I found that even with strong commitment to climate change action, the Xi Jinping leadership has recently relaxed its action in the regard. So
relaxed its climate actions.
So
let's come back to that
Yes.
in a bit. Deb, I want to turn to you. If you have anything to add about what propels China's climate agenda at the moment,
So first of all, I wanted to say, in Guoguang's report, you get this incredible depth about all of the ministries that play a role, the different leading groups. He really searches for information on which of these leading groups are still in existence and which aren't, which is an incredibly helpful contribution. And I think also highlights the importance on these areas. There's been this discussion in China, because politics exists as much in autocracies as democracies, about whether it's just the party or it's the party in the government. And I think one of the things this report highlights is that government institutions are really important in areas where there's a lot of technical knowledge that needs to happen. And so the roles of NDRC, the role of MEE, in climate policy is actually important, and it isn't just some party group. They're sort of giving the direction, but there's a lot of implementation, and the devil is in the details. I think Guoguang's point about economic development is really important, and is especially important in terms of who the players are, because large state-owned enterprises as well as innovative companies coming up are really important to shaping China's climate policies, and for both good and ill, right? So the whole solar industry, which really started with independent companies, as it became bigger, became part of China's overall policy and where the government is encouraging it. But it really came from independent entrepreneurs in Jiangsu province. And one of the things that we've seen, and we're working on a report right now on this issue of how important is coal versus other fuels with my partners at Tsinghua, is that solar has just taken off in the last year. And it's just incredible how much it's risen. And so these kinds of companies that are doing solar, doing wind, producing heat pumps, producing electric vehicles of every size, right, from huge trucks to two-wheel vehicles and everything in between, they all play a role and are really part of what's propelling China's climate policy forward. On the other hand, of course, you have large state-owned enterprises that still produce coal, are used to producing coal-powered electricity, and there's a little pushback there, but really the push for building coal-fired power plants is coming from local governments, as Guoguang also mentioned, because there was an energy shortage a couple years ago caused by the power companies not stockpiling enough coal. Crazy things about pricing in China. Electricity is regulated, coal is not. So when the coal price goes up, oftentimes the power plants sit around and wait for the price to come down again. They waited too long. They created an electricity shortage. Usually these things also include a snowstorm or something. This one was in September. There was no weather excuse, right? It was absolutely just bad management.
But no leader wants an electricity
shortage.
Cut.
So local governments are busy building their own power plants. But I think the point that I want to make is that's not going to lead to more coal being burned. It's going to mean it's burned in different plants. That the rise of renewables, the fact that renewables are now cheaper than coal-fired power, means that what we're going to have is a lot of empty coal-fired power plants. But I think that the role of companies in shaping it, and of course all these companies, even the big coal companies, electricity companies, they've all now invested in renewables. They see opportunity. On the vehicle side, electric vehicles in every category are now dominant, and that's where they see their future. So
I'm glad you brought up electric vehicles because I want to get your take on what message does the Inflation Reduction Act send, or is meant to send, and just very quickly on that, and Li Shuo, what is China's reply to the Inflation Reduction Act? So very quickly.
So I think the IRA itself they saw as manageable because there's a view that even with a $7,500 subsidy for American-produced electric vehicles, Chinese vehicles could be competitive. So the real question is going to be what additional tariffs are being put on Chinese vehicles. And that's where the message happens. And it's really where, I mean, because I agree with the idea that we need to rebuild America's industrial capacity. I don't think you get long-term political support in the U.S. for the climate transition if we think it's purely an import play. But I do think the speed of our transition is going to mean that we need to have both domestically produced and imported vehicles. So the question is, can we get to some kind of balance, as it looks like maybe the Europeans have? I mean, what was interesting, and Li Shuo can actually probably knows even more about this than I do, is when the Europeans finally put their tariffs on the Chinese vehicles, BYD was given a 38% tariff. That actually caused their stock price to rise because people thought it was going to be higher. So they think they can be competitive at 38%. I think that's not surprising given that Japanese vehicles, the minivans and the trucks, have been competitive at 25 for years in the U.S. So it's a question of some kind of balance.
Yeah. Li Shuo, how are you reading China's reply to the IRA and the tariffs contained?
Sure, Somini. I think when China looks at the Inflation Reduction Act, they see several things. One thing is, they just see fundamental challenges that the U.S. has to face in advancing its domestic decarbonization agenda. I think there is this understanding in China that the idea behind IRA is you need to start some sort of a green low carbon industry so that there's political impetus, right, behind the decarbonization agenda here. I think that idea is appreciated by the Chinese side. But at the same time, when China looks at the IRA, they also see a country trying to do what China did, not now, but 20 years ago. And they see the country, they see the United States lagging, frankly, far behind. I also think that they see the U.S. trying to get itself into many of the races, and some of the races probably the wrong ones. Such as solar, manufacturing solar panels. I think increasingly also, wind and electricity, electric vehicle and energy storage. So there's also a question, I think, in their mind. Is the U.S. getting into the right race, the right competition? Yeah. And also in addition to the IRA, the most recent trade measures, tariffs against Chinese-made low carbon products, going back to the small yard high fence narrative, is the yard being expanded, increasingly, to the extent that it puts the U.S.'s domestic ability to reduce emissions into question. And I think all of this is important, not only on the economic front, right? Who will be leading the future green race, but this fundamentally, I think, will shape future global climate politics, because whether the IRA will deliver what it promises will very much determine whether the U.S. will be able to reduce its emissions over the long run. And of course, whether the U.S. will be able to do it will shape China's own climate discourse. And that's also something that Guoguang documented very well in his report, the international factor in shaping China's domestic climate agenda.
I mean, I think you hit on a central question here. And by the way, audience members, please do prepare your questions. We will take some shortly. Keep them very short and keep them questions, please. But I think you hit on the central question that still bewilders many of us. This green transition arms race that the US and China seem to be in right now, will it speed up or slow down climate action globally? Anyone jump in? Li Shuo, you have thoughts on this, so please.
Sure. I think, look, like my team covers very extensively U.S.-China climate engagement. So we're kind of very G2-centric. But this question, I do think we need to kind of jump out of the U.S. and China. We also need to realize that much of the rest of the world has a say, and they have a role in this. I think one interesting dynamic we will see as a result of some of the trade measures here in the U.S., as a result of China probably not be able to sell as many green products as it has been to Western markets, is many of those products, we're talking about solar panels, wind turbines, battery, electric vehicles, going into global South markets. And this will be an increasing trend that we will see. And at the same time, many of the global South countries are trying to not just buy products made in China. They're trying to attract Chinese investment.
Trying to make those products,
to start their own domestic, manufacturing industry as well. So I think an interesting question there is, will this actually accelerate global decarbonization process? Will this actually help countries like Chile, Indonesia, the Philippines, speed up their climate action or not?
So, I mean, Guoguang, back to you, just very quickly, given that growing this economy has been such a driving factor for Chinese climate policy, if it can't sell its products because of these high tariffs, what do you think China can do? And what do you think it's planning to do?
I think that's also a question perplexing the current leadership. We will see what kind of a solution they will have in the forthcoming July when the Central Committee of the Communist Party have its major meeting. So I think I'm not able to answer the question because the Chinese leadership is also, perplexed, confused with this question. So with really such a kind of, global competition, and so is that possible for China to just rely on green technologies to transform its economy completely in pretty short time? I guess the answer is not. So still, they need to rely on many relatively traditional sectors to promote its economic performance. So that's, I think, the really big challenge. And also, very briefly, back to the question about the China-US competition. I think, today, so many factors are uncertain. So in this country, in November, we don't know what will happen. So actively, when Xi Jinping came to power, so he cooperated with the Obama administration, on the climate change agenda for a number of years. I think pressure from the Obama administration to the Xi Jinping leadership regarding climate change really helped China to do those kind of pledges, things like that. And later when the Trump administration retreated from this kind of commitment, and maybe, I guess, my analysis, the Xi Jinping leadership saw opportunity to so-called, in their word, take the leadership in global governance on climate change. And now the situation could be really different. We don't know what will happen. So I hope if, the Chinese leadership, after November, still sees opportunity to do something, taking more role, activity in global leadership of climate change, that would be good.
Hold that thought on November,
Yes.
but quickly.
So The thing about China exporting is China could decide to focus on domestic demand. When they've done that in the past, it's always been infrastructure. But there's actually a lot of need for Chinese consumers, whether companies or individuals, to buy more green products. They don't only have to go overseas, right? Tremendous effort to switch out to heat pumps in the areas around Beijing and into Shandong, but there's the whole rest of the country that still has to happen in. There's a lot. Shenzhen is now 100% electric vehicles. Beijing, Shanghai, you see them everywhere. As you go to a fourth-tier city, I was in Liuzhou this summer, it's a much lower percentage. So getting many more of these vehicles switched out domestically. So they could choose to do that. In order to do that, there are a lot of things that economists say they have to do to restore the lost savings of the public that happened during COVID. There are a lot of smart ideas about it. The government would have to focus more on people instead of companies, which has been they're the only country among major economies that didn't give direct subsidies to the public during COVID. And so it's just a very different approach. On U.S.-China, I think the competition, if we can keep tariffs relatively low and really compete, it could be great. If we start blocking things that we need, and I mean batteries are the obvious ones, we're trying to build this battery factory, has become such a political hot potato. If one single battery factory is impossible to do, we're going to be in a lot of trouble on decarbonization.
Let's look forward to November. Nervous laughter. Note. Okay, so what's the view from Beijing? Oh, those Americans are having one of those elections again. Shuo.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, just before I answer that question, something interesting here, I just want everyone to realize, Xi Jinping likes to say that we're seeing profound changes unseen in 100 years. He often says that. But I think what we just discussed here is indeed profound changes unseen, in many, many years. We've discussed, this deglobalization sentiment right here in the U.S. The most cost-efficient, low-carbon products made in China may not necessarily be deployed here in the U.S. Guoguang also, and of course, connected to the November question, if Trump is elected, we could see, major damage to the multilateral system. So I think the point here is a lot of the fundamental conditions that we relied on for so many years to drive the global climate agenda, we may not be able to rely on them anymore, right? Globalization, multilateralism, and so on. So this is the fundamental challenge that we're facing. But to go back to the November election question, I do think if we are looking at the Trump scenario, the damages that we could see potentially will be much more profound than last time around, both to U.S.-China climate relationship, but also to the overall multilateral regime.
Top three risks, concretely.
Just top one.
Top one.
If Trump decides to not only withdraw from the Paris Agreement,
Again.
but from the overall climate convention, then we're looking at a very difficult and interesting situation that we've never seen, which is in the global legal regime, the U.S. is out, and probably permanently out. Will never be able to return to this building, whereas others are still working in this same structure. Then the very important question that China needs to confront is, what do we do? Are we going to move with the rest who are still living in this building, or are we going to go out on the street and do something else?
That was the question last time the U.S. pulled out, and China did not leave the building. And now it's significantly later, and that energy transition train seems to have left the station. So November, top risk for you, Deb, and top risk for you.
I actually think the biggest risk is going to affect Europe rather than China, to be honest, because I think there are a lot of domestic drivers of China's carbon transition. I think it'll be faster if the U.S. is pushing, but I don't think it disappears because the U.S. puts on the brakes. But the Europeans are already feeling like they have been out ahead for 20, 30 years now, and the U.S. is constantly behind. We've seen the recent rise in right-wing parties in the European parliamentary elections. So I'm afraid that that's why the whole structure is much more vulnerable now than it was in 2016. I'm not sure technically that Trump can withdraw from anything, right? I mean, that's what happened to him with Paris because they set up this 4-year withdrawal. As long as the next president changes his mind on the first day, it doesn't happen. And I need to go back and read the actual 1992 Framework Convention because I'm not sure what the notification period is for that one. I do think that the risk that the U.S. starts causing trouble in more venues is much higher now than last time because there are going to be more true believers in the second Trump administration. So think about our votes on the World Bank, for example.
Right.
Last time, those guys were just continuing in their technocratic way with less involvement. So I think the risks are greater. I will also say, at least when I was in China last summer, people there actually were just assuming Trump was going to win.
Guoguang, top risk
Yeah.
for you.
I guess with the much reduced international pressure, the Chinese leadership will substantially retreat from its climate change pledge. I should add that international influence is a major factor to actively inspire the Chinese leadership to climate action. So, I mean, for its own utility, it does that. But the initiation came out from actively international pressure. So if November we see conservative government coming into power, and so trade war with China will become priority for the bilateral relationship, and those commitments like climate change will be sidelined. So I guess the Chinese leadership will take the opportunity, as already discussed, their domestic pressure, so retreat substantially. I think that would be really big risk for humankind because the two largest economies, both of them, they will reduce their commitment to climate change. That would be really big problem.
Mics will come around for questions. Before the mics come to you, can I just ask one really quick one? In China's climate considerations, do the voices does human rights matter at all? Whether it's labor in Xinjiang, you've heard all of the criticism from Congress on that, whether it's environmental defenders around the world that are opposing Chinese projects. To what extent does this matter right now in China's climate change agenda? Guoguang?
Okay. We know that generally human rights are not a big issue for the Chinese government. So they just use this issue in international negotiation, doing diplomacy. But for domestic, particularly labor rights, minorities' rights, so there are so many troubles because of Chinese government's, repression in the regard. So I think that's really good question because the Chinese political system is so different from that in this country, and here social activists plays really critical role for promoting agenda climate action. So those things are connected with human rights activities. But in China, even we see the Xi Jinping leadership try to do a lot of things in climate change, but so differently, the leadership also increases its crackdown over social activists in climate change, in whatever actively. So that's really big challenge if the political turn to the right really takes place worldwide, and the situation in China regarding human rights will be worse. That's really big risk, I think, also.
Okay, questions? Got a mic here. Yes.
While others are gathering these thoughts and questions, I just want to make a quick comment, not a quick question, to echo what Deborah said. I won't say that Chinese assume that there will be Trump 2.0. I want to reframe that a little bit. Is we shouldn't wait and see. We should start doing to repeat what I said in DC yesterday, is that we should go above, we should go beyond, we should go below, we should go left, and we should go right. Because federal collaboration is at risk no matter what. And not only in China, Japan, Australia, all preparing for Trump 2.0. I think subnational, commercial, sectoral, multilateral, we should prepare all of them. I think that's essentially the directions we have to go and we should go. That's just a comment I'm trying to make. Thank you.
There's a mic back there.
Yeah,
Yes.
Me? Yeah. Hi, Bill Spindle from Cipher News. We're a news organization that covers the energy transition globally. You guys have touched on this a little bit, but one of the huge challenges of this energy transition is going to be the amount of money that needs to move from the wealthy countries that have it to the developing countries that don't. It's pretty clear that's not going to happen in a direct way on anything even remotely close to the scale needed. But there's a kind of interesting a not awful plan B coming into view, I think, where that you've touched on a bit, which is that the India, the US, Europe set up a bunch of trade barriers, agree essentially to pay higher prices for their solar panels, for their EVs, for their batteries. And on the other hand, China sends a lot more of what it's producing into these developing countries at very low prices. I think two things have to happen for that you've touched on. One is the US, India, and Europe have to figure out how to stand up these industries on some level, at least. If they want to pay higher prices to do it, fine. The second, though, is whether China is willing and able, and the Chinese system is set up to pour the amount of funding that would be needed to not only send these products into these areas, but to build the infrastructure around it, which China seems to have done pretty well with Belt and Road, for example. Is it set up to do that? And we're talking massive investments in grid infrastructure, in EV charging networks, in the sort of things that are not just build the projects, but build the infrastructure around it.
Yeah, what happened to Green Belt and Road, or greening the Belt and Road?
So the amount of money on the Belt and Road has gone way down.
Right.
So I don't think right now China feels prepared to do any of that. I do think that the U.S. not importing from China doesn't necessarily mean things are produced in the United States or in the USMCA, except for vehicles. And so, I mean, what we've seen, solar is produced in Malaysia and Thailand, and I think we'll see a lot more of that, right, rather than production in the United States. On the Chinese side, I mean, a lot of the stuff that China has successfully exported to very poor developing countries is the stuff that doesn't require centralized infrastructure. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. So we've already seen that with local solar everywhere, right? I think the next important step is going to be electric two-wheelers. And those don't require fancy charging infrastructure. They do require enough electricity, and the Chinese are still pretty eager to export electric power systems to countries. But I think it's going to be a challenge, and especially the grid upgrades are going to be a challenge. I think you're 100% right that this solution is not the ideal solution. And I think one thing to remember is that the U.S. has always been pretty supportive of doing a lot of this through the World Bank. They just haven't been as enthusiastic about doing it through alternative financial mechanisms. So one of the questions is whether we can get some more consensus on using the traditional development banks, because that's going to be the easier route. And given Congress, no matter who's in charge, I think it's actually the only route we can use in the U.S.
Question here.
Thank you so much. My name is Aaron. I'm a finance professional here in New York. I'm also a Schwarzman Scholar, graduated in 19. One of the tendencies we see in the West is to couch climate issues in security terms. And I don't just mean energy dependence. I also mean averting natural disasters, preventing migration flows that could destabilize countries and so forth. With China being a country that's very prone to natural disasters, we saw in 2023 great flooding and so forth, how much are we seeing climate issues couched in those security terms in China?
Oh, I'll just quickly jump in. I appreciate that question. I think if we go back to Guoguang's framework, right, the 5 drivers propelling China's climate action, I actually see an additional driver, which is related to climate impact. Because climate impact will affect China in a very negative way and in increasingly significant way. And I think as this panel has already highlighted, all these drivers, they are very dynamic, right? Sometimes they become stronger drivers, sometimes they become weaker drivers. But if you think about climate impact and how China think about it, how China has to react to it, that driver, in terms of its power in propelling China's climate action, is only going to grow stronger. And the reason of that is simple. We will see more climate impacts, stronger ones, affecting China and much of the rest of the world in a much stronger way. So I do think in the medium to long term, that is one angle that China should take note of and should hopefully also accelerate China's decarbonization process.
Question on the right. Yep.
Hi. Thank you very much. Guoguang suggested that come November, if Trump were to be elected, it sounds to me like the progress that's being dealing with the climate change and the green initiatives sort of goes by the wayside. I was wondering if the 2 other panelists share that opinion that if Trump were to be victorious in November, are we just going to go backwards, and to what extent are we? How far back are we actually going to go?
I think we're going to slow down. I don't think we're going to go backwards. So, I mean, the thing I try to reassure my interlocutors in China is the IRA was brilliantly designed, right? Because most of it are tax credits, right? And it's very hard to get a Republican to vote for raising taxes. And so I think a significant amount of the IRA is pretty stable. And it's very unlikely that the Republicans are going to control both houses of Congress. I mean, I still think whether Biden or Trump wins is currently, 50-50 right now. It's not a sure thing that Trump will win. The Chinese think it is, but I don't think it is. But so on the U.S. side, it slows down. I think it puts more pressure on the states, which is why the subnational stuff becomes even more important. And one of the things we have to think creatively about is how to get subnational cooperation with China to not just be California-China cooperation, and think about how to think about other states. And I am an advocate for Texas, which is the leader in renewable energy in the United States, despite having Republican leadership, and every major city in Texas is run by a Democrat. So I think there's an opportunity there that people have not taken advantage of. On the Chinese side, again, I think they're moving ahead. I think there are a lot of domestic forces. I think climate change matters. What I do think healthy competition makes everybody work harder. And so I think it will, again, change the pace relative to what it might have been. But I don't think anyone goes backwards.
Can I just say very quickly, I don't think we can underestimate the potential damages created by Trump. And I think the question in the mind of many climate strategists is the following. If we're looking at Trump too, are we looking at the same kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back dynamic? So we model through, we have 4 years of Trump, we kind of go backward, and then we'll just go forward. Or are we looking at a scenario where the damage that he creates is so profound, so the climate agenda is completely derailed, and at the same time we have the urgency. Remember, climate is a time-bound crisis. Certain things need to happen before 2030, and if they're not happening, we're looking at a very different environmental problem. So in front of me there are 2 scenarios: modeling through, or just completely being derailed, and there will then be a need for a global awakening. Where do we go from there?
Just one thing.
Yes, please.
Actively, I think trade wars, technological, sanctions, those kind of things can be effective policy leverage to give pressure to China to do something, for example, in climate action. So the problem is if we combine them together, or we just actively do something, trade war for trade wars, not for value added. I mean, ideological, political value added.
So there's a difference in your mind between competition and healthy competition. Yeah. We are at time, so I'm going to ask a lightning round. One word that describes the current state of U.S.-China relations. Shuo.
Yeah, well, in terms of climate engagement.
One word.
Well, they meet and they disagree. That's the current dynamic.
Sorry?
They meet. There's this political intention to engage, but when they engage, they just disagree with each other.
Disagree. Disagreement. One word.
Not great.
Estranged.
Estranged.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you all for your great questions. Thank you to the panel.